You okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, issues from the results of you have problems with walking. No, just what's going on in the world.
We all have issues with that. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm glad you all could come, and good to see everybody and some new faces. Val and Jen are back, so glad to have you guys. Did everybody get the YouTube to work? Could you get the YouTube to work? Score. That is awesome. I got tired of waiting for the church. I was like, come on, Caleb. And then I was just like, okay, I'll just see if I can figure it out myself. So great. So now you can watch it if you, like I said in the email, if you're bored, if you're having sleep trouble at night, you can just turn it on and you'll be out for life. Just a little administration. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be here next week. So I know you all are just terribly upset. But my mom and dad appreciate you sharing me with them. So I'm going to go see my parents next weekend and visit them. So no class next week, and then I'll be back the week. They live in Texas, in College Station. I would if I could. I would if I could. So no class next week, and then good morning. And then I will send out an email just to remind everybody, but we'll meet. And honestly, I was looking at my calendar, and I don't think there'll be any other times through Christmas that I'm going to be gone. So, and we'll the only other times we'll not meet is, of course, the weekend of Thanksgiving and the weekend of between Christmas and New Year's. But other than that, we should meet each week. So I want to pick up where we last left off last week. And our hero, King Hezekiah, was defending Jerusalem against the Assyrians. This is around 690, 700 BCE. And I was doing some more research on Hezekiah over this week and ready for this. And scholars have noted, and I saw this in a couple of different textbooks and articles, that Hezekiah is actually one of the best attested historical figures from the Bible. He has more references in outside material than just about any other character. I don't want to say 100%, but I want to say pretty close. Maybe even better than Jesus, because when you look at contemporaneous mentions, so people mentioning him, that things that date to about the time when he lived. For Jesus, you have all the Gospels and the letters of Paul, but outside of the Bible, there's really not much about Jesus until you get into the mid-2nd century. And then as this idea of Jesus being God grew and he became the central figure of the new Christian religion, of course there's, since then there's hundreds of thousands and millions of references to Jesus. But when you look at mentions at the time that the person lived, Hezekiah probably, I don't want to say 100% because I can't account for everybody, but he's probably pretty close. So if you remember last week, the Assyrians had destroyed the northern kingdom, carried them all away, had surrounded Jerusalem, had laid it under siege. And after about 3 years, the Bible says, they woke up the morning and Hezekiah went out with his morning coffee and all the Syrians were dead. Half of them were dead and the other half were gone. In the Syrian Chronicles, the Sennacherib says, I had this guy crushed. I had him like a bird in a cage, and he paid me millions and billions of dollars, and now I'm, and so I left. There's not a lot of clear understanding about what actually happened. You could believe one of the two sides, but honestly, both sides have a tendency to spin the facts their way. But it is pretty possible. There's a lot of scholars. I wouldn't say it's the consensus view, but it's maybe a big view that Hezekiah may have cut some kind of deal to save Jerusalem. Because what happened after that, after they left, the Judeans started paying tribute again back to Assyria. And we move into a time of relative peace. And you move into a time of relative peace. So, it's a lot of scholars say he may have just kind of cut a deal, said, listen, you guys haven't taken the city in 3 years. You got better things to do. I'm tired of fighting. I'll pay you guys what you want. I won't be a problem anymore. I won't, create insurrection. And hey, Trey, good morning. And everything will be good. So that may have been what happened. The other thing that was very interesting is around this time, archaeologists have found that there was a pretty considerable increase in the population of the kingdom of Judah. And they can see this in the archaeological records from increased number of settlements, more pottery and debris in the old parts of Jerusalem. And they said that Jerusalem went from a city of about 4,000 or 5,000 people to about 25,000 people during the 7th century, late 8th century and early 7th century. And some archaeologists speculate that that's because as the northern kingdom got destroyed, that was the most populous kingdom. And for most of its history, Israel, the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, was the primary kingdom. That was the one that had all the money and most of the people. Judea was kind of the wilderness, the outpost. It was right on the edge of the desert. So it wasn't very populated, but that started to shift. A lot of archaeologists think that may have been as a result of refugees leaving the northern kingdom, trying to get away from the Assyrians as they came in and decimated the northern kingdom. To me, that makes a pretty good argument. Sometimes when you look at archaeology, you see two things and they kind of make sense, but there's no real evidence that connects them. So you're left with a little bit of speculation. But to me, that makes a lot of sense. It could also be just because the northern kingdom's now gone, the southern kingdom is the only remaining regional power, and that would attract people, whether they're refugees or whether they're just starting to grow. There's no more place for them to migrate off to. So, but we definitely see a rise in the population of the kingdom of Judah, and that becomes really important, as we're going to see, because during this 100 or so year period, 120, 130 years from when the northern kingdom was destroyed to when the Babylonians came a-knocking in Jerusalem, that the mindset in Judah was, we're untouchable. Our God has protected us. Adonai has protected us. Nothing is going, God is fulfilling his promises that God made to Abraham and to David. This kingdom is untouchable. And I think that really started to get into their mindset. So this is where we are right now. This 150, 120, 130 year period is what we're going to talk about next. So following King Hezekiah got old, 50, and died. Back then, the lifespan was not what it is today. So all these kings who lived into their old age were all making it to 50, 55 years old. So, and so his son, Manasseh, became king. He became king when he was 12 years old. He reigned for 55 years. So Manasseh actually outlived a lot of people. He was 67-ish when he finally died. But the Bible does not have a lot of good things to say about King Manasseh. Manasseh, according to 2 Kings 21, Manasseh did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, following the abominable practices of the nations that the Lord had drove out, that's bad English, before the people of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places that his father Hezekiah had destroyed. He erected altars for Baal. He made a sacred pole to worship Asherah, another big Canaanite goddess. and as King Ahab of Israel had done, and worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. In other words, Hezekiah had started to make reforms to kind of rein in the worship of other gods and just make the cult central to the temple. And I use the word cult because not in a way we use cult today, where it's like, weird people off doing kind of weird things. Cult in the sense that everything was driven around these ritual practices. When you go to the temple, you follow a ritual, you do the thing, that's called cultic practice. So, but Manasseh kind of was like, no, we're going back to the normal way, quote unquote, the normal way of doing business. Everybody else worships multiple gods. Why are we making everybody worship just our God? They should, if they want to worship Asherah, they should be able to worship Asherah. If they want to worship Baal, they should be able to worship Baal. He kind of moved back to that polytheistic thinking. And while the Bible doesn't really care for Manasseh, the Assyrians love Manasseh because he said, look, dudes, I'm not going to fight with you. I'm going to pay your tribute. You can count on us. We're not going to buck your authority. You guys have done a good job. Good morning. Stabilizing the region. And for 55 years, it was pretty peaceful in Israel. The economy began to grow. They started being able to do more importing and exporting. There's archaeologists have found a real increase in olive oil production and trade during this period of time, which was a chief agricultural product coming out of Judah. So he really led them into a new phase of prosperity. The economy grew. He also started building a lot of fortresses, either building or rebuilding to the south and to the east of Jerusalem. And if we go back to the map real quick, just for a second, here's Judah, here's Jerusalem. The Assyrians are all up this way. So if Manasseh's building fortresses here and here, he's kind of providing a ring of protection around the Assyrian Empire, trying to push the extents of where, so that if the Egyptians start coming up or the Philistines start coming in wanting to fight with the Assyrians, there's a first round of protection before they really get into Assyrian territory. So the Assyrians love Manasseh. He's mentioned in a couple of places. These are some other stelae from the Assyrian Empire. This one is from the king Esarhaddon. I'll let you work on that yourself. And he mentions Manasseh, saying, I called up the kings of Hattai. Hattai is the area to the north, the area we call Turkey now, Turkey and Syria. I called up the kings of Hattai and of the region on the other side of the Euphrates, Balu, king of Tyre, Manasseh, king of Judah, ... He lists off all the other kings. And then he said, together these 22 kings, the seashore and the islands, all of these I sent out and made them transport under terrible difficulties, send to Nineveh building materials for my palace. Timbers, logs, cedar, all these materials. So the king of Assyria says, hey, I'm doing a home renovation here in Nineveh on my palace. I need some stuff. You got nice trees up there and rocks and all this stuff. Send them up to me. And Manasseh was one of the ones who said, absolutely, no problem, and helped take care of it. This guy, Ashurbanipal, they didn't go for short names back then. They were like, the longer the name, the better off you are. He followed the last dude whose name I can't pronounce. And he mentions Manasseh in a military sense. He said, during my march to Egypt, so Egypt was starting to push back against the Assyrian Empire. Remember, we talked about in the first class, this is kind of an age of empires. Egypt was the old empire that had kind of shrunk in size. So they're starting to push up against the Assyrians. So this guy sends Manasseh and a bunch of others, and they came and they brought heavy gifts to me. They kissed my feet, and I made these kings accompany my army over the land as well as over the sea with their armed forces in the ships. So when he went out to fight against Egyptians, all these kings, including Manasseh, said, hey, we're right there with you. We'll fight with you. So they became very strong allies of Assyria. Which puts you in the perspective of this is a time when it's not separation of church and state. Church is state, state is church. The gods are prominent within the culture and the life of governments. So it's possible that what Manasseh was doing annoyed the biblical writers because he was siding with the Assyrians, but and forsaking Israelite or Judean independence as God had promised. I think there's a lot of things at work here. And I just want to take a little aside here to talk about, when we talk about the biblical writers, this group of texts that we've been talking about, Samuel and Kings, these are the stories of the monarchy from King Saul all the way to the end of it. This has been called the Deuteronomistic history. Martin Noth is a German scholar in the early 20th century, and he's kind of the one who put this out and said, if you read the book of Deuteronomy, it's got a certain mindset. And when you go after that through Joshua, Judges, Kings, Samuel, Kings, you see that same mindset kind of stretching throughout all of those books, all of those historical books. And so he put forth this theory that this is kind of written or at least collated and compiled by a single author or a group of authors who have this very specific view of Judean independence, worship of Yahweh in the temple, not worshiping other gods, not putting up with any other gods. So it's a very specific mindset. And one that, while has had some revisions over the past 100 years since Not put it out, has pretty much stood the test of time. It's been tweaked a bit from how he originally saw it, but most scholars today would agree with Not. So while the Deuteronomists and one of the things that they follow, their theology in the book of Deuteronomy, is what's called a retributional theology. In other words, you do something bad, God's going to punish you. You do something good, God's going to bless you. So you see this in all the stories. If you remember, David was a man after God's own heart, so God blessed him. The other kings, King Manasseh, did not. They did what was evil, and so God is condemning them. But the historian had a problem, and that was Manasseh lived for 67 years. He reigned for 55 years, the longest reign in the history of Judah. No king reigned longer than Manasseh. They prospered economically. They were at peace. How is it that was that bad? So they have to go into the theology and they have to say, because according to this retributional theology, God should have done something about that. Come on, God, why aren't you taking care of this? This guy's not doing what you want. Why aren't you taking care of him and putting him in his place? And what we're going to see is they come up with this idea that there's delayed retribution. God got so ticked off, he didn't deal with Manasseh, but he's going to deal with Israel sooner or later. So it's coming. It's coming. That's the mindset in this Deuteronomistic history. So they can't deny the facts. The facts are the facts. I guess that was before fake news, and they couldn't just say fake news. So they have to say, we know that he reigned for a long time, and it was a peaceful time frame, but it was bad, and you don't know how bad because things are coming, and you'll see how bad it was. One final note is the Bible accuses Manasseh of sacrificing children, doing child sacrifice. And so in 2 Kings 21, it said, Manasseh made his son pass through fire. He practiced soothsaying and augury, dealt with mediums and with wizards. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking the Lord to anger. While it is speculative whether Manasseh did this, there is a pretty strong historical record that says that Israelite kings and the Israelites did practice human sacrifice from time to time, although it is vehemently condemned by not just these biblical writers, but the prophets, the psalmists. And so you see it in Jeremiah. Jeremiah is like, you made your children pass through fire. I never asked you to do that. Why would I even think of asking you to sacrifice children? What's wrong with you people? It wasn't like it was every day you're hauling kids out and sacrificing them, but it seems to be a thing. And some of that comes from why would the biblical writers spend so much time condemning something that wasn't occurring? And in fact, there's stories where Israelite in Judges, where one of the Israelite judges makes an untimely oath and says he'll sacrifice the first thing he sees. He won this big battle. He said, when I get home, whatever I see first is what I'll sacrifice. And of course, he rides into town, and who comes out of the house but his youngest daughter? And so now he's got to sacrifice his daughter. And he does. And the Bible just relays that event. This is why you don't let your kids read the Bible. Or at least be very selective about what you let your kids read.
So the question is,
yeah.
If they pass through the fire, that actually means they're the sacrifice, the life of sacrifice. It's not just walking through the fire or like kids
No.
do now.
I don't quite know how they put all of that etymology together, but that all the scholarship I've read is pass through the fire means you killed, just like Abraham and Isaac. And it's kind of like that whole mindset of, even though in that story Abraham didn't go through with it, but that was the whole mindset, was to have Isaac pass through the fire, become a sacrifice for God. That's what God asked of Abraham in the story, but then didn't go through with it at the end.
I wonder what it was that caused them to have such a mindset, and then even more, why did they stop?
Right.
What happened that made them
Right.
change their ways?
Right. I don't know what made them stop. Some of it may have been people pushing back. You think about slavery. Slavery was accepted as kind of a normal thing for years, but there became a groundswell of people pushing back against slavery, saying we can't do it anymore. This is wrong, and so that may have been what it is. Other cultures also practiced sacrifice, and it was kind of like a fertility deal. They kind of were, in their mindset, listen, we have, normally you had like 10, 11, 15 kids you needed, because the infant mortality rate was so high and the lifespans were so short. If you're going to survive in a kind of hand-to-mouth existence in an agrarian society, you need people to work the fields. And if you don't have them, so if I have my firstborn and I sacrifice them to the gods to make the gods happy, and they give me 15 more, that's maybe a worthwhile investment. It's just I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying that that's the mindset of where they were at the time. We are not dealing with 20th century people here who've gone through the Enlightenment, and they had a whole different view of how the world worked and how gods worked. And Yahweh was just one of the gods. He was Israel's God, but Yahweh is just one of the gods. And there's all these other gods. There's this whole pantheon of gods who do all this stuff. And so if you're an Israelite, your God is Yahweh, and that's who you need to worship. But this whole idea of monotheism was not present at the time, and you had to make the gods happy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of weeks, because it kind of really comes up in the next section we go to. Okay, so Manasseh dies, his son Ammon takes his place. Nobody liked Ammon, and they knocked him off in 2 years. And then came Josiah. And Josiah is, I mean, the only thing better than Josiah would be getting David back from the dead. I mean, according to the biblical writers, because Josiah was amazing. He did everything right. They love him. He had huge biblical reforms. He took all the reforms from his great grandfather Hezekiah, implemented them, and then went even further. Tore down all these shrines, went out. Whereas Hezekiah closed down the shrines, Josiah destroyed the shrines, these other religious sites. So he according to the Deuteronomistic historian, he was the best thing that ever happened to Israel. He also found himself kind of as a powerful religious leader because the Assyrian Empire, while not defeated, was starting to lose its grip. There was a lot of inner turmoil. They were having a lot of not quite civil war, but coups and attempted coups, and they had a lot of internal strife going on. So as their grip started to lessen, he became kind of a regional leader. Now, Egypt, who had been an adversary of Assyria, kind of started they saw this opportunity too, and they linked up with Assyria. They went and cut a deal with Assyria, so Egyptians started to move in, but it's a time of shifting politics and shifting power struggle within this area. So Josiah became kind of an important person, and Judea was kind of a very important ruler. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't under the thumb of the Assyrians or some other group. They kind of had their own autonomy. Two big things happened with Josiah. One is in 2 Kings 22, Josiah was like, hey, we need to fix up the temple. It's getting a little shabby. We need another redo. Go, priests, go clean out the temple, count up how much silver and gold you have, because we're going to do a refurbishment. Need to know how much money you have, and kind of get things cleaned up for me so we can do this big renovation. And so they went and they did that, and the priests discovered the book of the law that had been hidden or put away in the temple, and everybody had forgotten about it. The biblical text says, the high priest Hilkiah said to Shaphan, the king's secretary, I found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And when Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, he read it. That makes sense. Well, what does this book say? And then Shaphan finished the book, and he's like, I got to go talk to the king. And he went to the king, and he said, hey, your servants have melted down the silver that was found in the house and delivered it into the hands of the Lord. And oh, by the way, Hilkiah found this book. You really ought to read it. So he gives it to Josiah. Well, actually, he didn't give it to Josiah. He read it to Josiah, which is interesting because it kind of, a lot of times the rulers and the kings in this period were not literate and couldn't read. So while they were literate people, but estimates are maybe like 2% of the population, 3% of the population were literate. And it probably wasn't the kings because they were busy, going to war and doing other stuff. So interesting little historical note that makes sense as to why he didn't give it to the king to read, but he read it to the king. So he read it to the king, and when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes and he said, this is bad. Go inquire of the Lord for me and for all of Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. Almost the consensus view in scholarship is that this story is discussing the writing of the book of Deuteronomy. That what they found in the temple was the book of Deuteronomy, or what they produced during that time frame to support the reforms of of Josiah was the book of Deuteronomy. And you can see things in that, because when you read the book of Deuteronomy, you get to the end and it's kind of written in the voice of Moses, telling the story of, recapturing or retelling all the law. And they get to the end and they say, and then Moses died and he was buried and nobody knows where to this very day. Now, if it was written by Moses or right after Moses, they say, no, we buried him right up at the top of the hill there. But if it's being written hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years later after what had supposedly transpired, it makes sense to say, we don't know where Moses is. He died, he was buried, we don't know where he is. So it could be that he finds in the biblical story, he finds the book of the law and uses that as the justification to kick off this massive reform campaign. But it could be that he kicked off this massive reform campaign and had composed or edited a final edit of a book that was kind of being worked on maybe during the time of Manasseh and Hezekiah and Manasseh, to say, here's the reason why we've got to do this reform campaign. Look at what we haven't been doing. Because it conveniently says that, and reflects the Deuteronomistic history, that all the kings who didn't do what was in the book were the bad kings, and all the kings who did do what was in the book were the good kings. Hard. Some of these things are hard, but we want to look at it critically. I don't want to just accept the biblical text for face value, but you have to kind of think through it all. And then at the end, we'll never know for sure. But I think we have to use some critical thinking and some reasoning to kind of think through this and say, well, there may have been two sides to this story. All right, so I think I actually said all this already. Most scholars say Deuteronomy was written around the time of Josiah and was used to justify his many political and religious reforms. So a big thing that comes out of that is the book of Deuteronomy. Then we get to the end of Josiah, and all this has a point. We're getting to driving home this point. Because without Manasseh, without the Assyrian invasion and destruction of the northern, I don't think there would have been a book of the law that was written during that time frame or compiled and finally edited during the time of Josiah. All these things are starting to build upon each other. So as we get to the end of the late 7th century, Assyria is really pulling back. Egypt, they had kind of allied themselves. They start to push out and have establish control over the Levant. And again, everybody wants control, of Israel, because it's the passageway to Egypt. If Egypt's going to move up into the north and take on Babylonians or whoever, then they have to be able to get through there. So Josiah goes out to battle. He goes out to meet Pharaoh Necho, and he gets killed in the battle. In Chronicles, which is kind of a retelling, they have a much more heroic end. In Kings, it just says Necho killed him, and they brought him back to Jerusalem. Pretty easy. And in Chronicles, it's a hero's death, man. It's like he rode out in his chariots, and they were streaming, and he took down hundreds of Egyptians. But finally, the Egyptian archers trained all their arrows on Josiah and shot him out of the chariot, and he hung on to life, and they took him back to Jerusalem, but alas, he died. So he died in the Chronicles, which is kind of a retelling, a hero's death. A lot of scholars are skeptical of these two stories because there are no historical records. The Egyptians kept immaculate records, and there's no record of a big military campaign during this period of time. So it's like, well, wait a minute, if this is this big battle and they killed the king of Judah in the middle of the battle, that would have been something that the Egyptians would have recorded and written down, but they didn't. And so what a lot of people think is, the Egyptians now have the role of the Assyrians to collect the tribute, and Josiah may not have paid his tribute or been plotting against the Egyptians, and they had him executed. Interesting things. But from the archaeological standpoint, these things, sometimes things align really well, and sometimes they don't. And this is one of those times where they don't. So, all right, moving on, getting to the climax of all of this. Babylon starts to rise in 626. Babylon, the great city in what's now Iraq, Iraq, starts to rise up against the Assyrians. The Assyrians are already having problems. They're in a severely weakened condition, so it's not too hard. The Babylonians take over the southern part of the kingdom, kind of their traditional territory, recapture that. And 6 years later, they go and they conquer the remaining Assyrian territory in Babylon. And at the same time, there's a group called the Medes. They're not exactly Persians, but from the northern part of Iraq. Iranian fighters. They're coming in kind of from the north, challenging the Assyrians. And so the Babylonians and the Medes join together and create become allies, and they're attacking Assyria. The Medes are coming in from the north. The Assyrians are coming up from the south. And in 612, they capture Nineveh. And in 609, they kill off the last Assyrian king. And then in 605, and so all that's left now is the Egyptians. They were the last big ally and so they're kind of fighting to see who's going to control. And the Babylonians defeat the Egyptian army in Carchemish, which paves the way for the Babylonian takeover. So lots of words. Let's talk a little bit about pictures. So here's Iraq, what's currently Iraq. This is historic Babylon. They pushed up and they came into this part of the Assyrian Empire. The Medes are over here in Iran, kind of this part, and they take over they started out in this little triangle area, but they take over all of this northern area, and the Babylonians kind of take the south, kind of an agreement, and they move their way all the way through to into the Levant, or just to the edge of Jerusalem. And if we blow up this map here, you can see, again, we talked about everybody's having to come back and forth this way. The Babylonians come up and fight their way up through the Assyrians up to here. The Egyptians are pushing up this way, and they all meet right here in Carchemish, which is up in present-day Turkey. And they have this big battle, and the Babylonians win. That then extends the Babylonian control all the way through the historic is Northern Kingdom territory, and they're poised right outside the territory of the Southern Kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem.
So the Egyptians went through that area and didn't kill everybody in Judah and Israel?
So Israel had already been taken over by the Palestinians, by the Assyrians. They were aligned with them, so they would kind of, and remember, Jerusalem's up here in the hill country, and then this is the coastal plain. So they were marching. The Egyptians had taken some of those fortresses that Manasseh had built. They had a pathway up through this area here. So again, they did fight battles, but with Josiah, like we talked about, there's no record of any real big military battle. They were just kind of moving through because that's what they always did, because all of this area had been under Assyrian control. Things ebb and things flow. So they come up this way, the Babylonians come up this way, and this is where they have
So they've been fighting forever for power for the region.
Power of the region. It was the Egyptians back in the day controlled all of this. They kind of around 1,000 to 1,200 had a receding. We'll talk about that in a little bit in some coming lectures, but there was just kind of this overall collapse of society of Bronze Age society during that time. Nobody's really sure why. Maybe famine, maybe some kind of natural event. But for whatever reason, a lot of big powers collapsed, and it made room for new ones. And then it would go back and forth, between the Judeans and the the northern kingdom of Israel. Then the Assyrians came. Now the Babylonians are coming. And then what we're going to hear about in a little while is, or some future classes, is when the Persians come. So then the Persians come and they take out the Babylonians, and everybody's fighting for control. And then come the Greeks, and then come the Romans. So everybody's looking for world domination, like a James Bond movie, right? Everybody's trying to take over the world, control everything, control all the money, the spices, the trade. There's a lot of economics that go in there. They've been fighting for 4,000, 5,000 years. Yeah.
What's the Levant in that?
The Levant is right in here. And it's a name that, I'm not sure where the name Levant comes from, but it's Israel. It kind of covers Judah, Israel, the Philistines, the up in Lebanon. It's this whole kind of very fertile stretch right through here. It encompasses more than just Israel or Judah. So it's kind of that whole region. Does that make sense? Any other questions or thoughts?
Where is Hamas?
I'm sorry?
Where is the fighting today that were such a big deal? That's enormous.
Right down here, Gaza. So Israel today kind of is this area. This area up here is the West Bank of the Jordan River. This area down here is the Gaza Strip. So this is Israel today, kind of right through here. And this is where all the fighting has occurred, right here along the coastline. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's been like that for thousands of years. These things have been going on. Okay, so after the Babylonians beat the Egyptians, they pretty much had control of everything. And the last bit that they needed to get was Jerusalem. So they show up in 605 and lay siege to Jerusalem. But the king at that time, Josiah's son, Jehoiakim, he was smart, and he's like, hey, listen, what do you want? I'll be a vassal state. You don't have to take us out. I'll pay your tribute. He pays the tribute. The siege ends. The Babylonians go back to Babylon to, kind of get their house in order. And for 4 or 5 years, things are pretty good. And then Jehoiakim grows a spine and, political pressures at home and says, you know what? Screw that. I'm not paying that. I'm not paying you guys anymore. I'm done with that. And so Nebuchadnezzar says, no problem. And in 598, he shows up again and he lays siege to Jerusalem. They put the city under siege for 3 months. During that time, Jehoiakim dies, and then his son Jehoiachin. There'll be a test on all these names at the end of the class. Jehoiachin, I guess they were running out of long, complicated names, so they just started doing. Anyway, he comes in, he gets deposed. The Babylonians capture the city. They don't destroy it yet, but they take Jehoiachin and all of the kind of ruling class, haul them off to Babylon to go into exile. So the first wave of Babylonian exile occurs in 598. And Nebuchadnezzar installs his own guy, Zedekiah, as a king. And his parting words with Zedekiah is, don't screw up, collect the taxes, send the money, and everything will be fine. I don't know if those were his exact words, but I'm paraphrasing. This whole story is also attested not only in the Bible, all that came from the biblical text. All of this is attested as well in what's called the Babylonian Chronicles. And again, the more I look at all this stuff, everything's in the British Museum. So we really need to do a trip to London to go see all of this stuff, because all of it's in the British Museum. And I'll leave you to read this on your own, but it basically corroborates the whole story that was in the Bible. So again, there's places where we get good, everything kind of comes together and good corroboration. And then there's other places where you get people spinning the results off for their own good. Okay, so the foreshadowing, of course, Zedekiah rules for about 7 years. And then one day he says, you know what? I can take these guys. This is not a problem. I'm the king. And so he goes and enters into an alliance with Pharaoh Hophra from Egypt. And he says, man, if with the Egyptians and the Judeans, we can shake off the yokes of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar says, yeah, thanks for the invite to the party. I'm going to RSVP with my entire army. He invades Judah again. Again, he lays siege to Jerusalem. This time it took him 30 months to breach the walls, but eventually they did. Zedekiah and his followers, in a true heroic effort, ran, deserted the city, deserted their people, dropped their weapons and ran, but they got captured in the plains of Jericho. Again, this is all in the biblical text, so if you go and read 2 Kings, you'll see all of this. They got captured, they got drugged back to Nebuchadnezzar, or to the general. The general, in front of Zedekiah, executed his sons and his family. Then he poked his eyes out, put them in chains, and carted them off to Jerusalem or to Babylon. So the king, the last king of Judah, was gone. And then Nebuchadnezzar says, we're not going through this again. Destroy the city. And the entire city was leveled, including the temple. And the Babylonians and they deported almost everybody. They left a few folks to work the fields because they wanted to get, somebody's got to work the fields. But all the educated class and the leadership was gone. And if we read in Lamentations, this is attested, again, by the Babylonians, but it's also attested in multiple sources in the Bible. Lamentations says, how the gold has grown dim, how the pure gold has changed, the sacred stones lie scattered at the head of every street. Those who feasted on delicacies perish in the streets. Those who were brought up in purple cling to ash heaps. For the chastisement of my people has been greater than the punishment of Sodom, which was overthrown in a moment. The Lord gave full vent to his wrath. He poured out his hot anger and kindled a fire in Zion that consumed its foundations. So that's where you see when you're reading the Bible, these things aren't all in order. You kind of have to jump around. So if you do decide to sit down and read the Old Testament, I highly recommend getting a really good study Bible or a textbook that can kind of guide you through that, but clearly written at the time of the Babylonian conquest. All right, so we spent a lot of time talking a lot of stuff. Why did we start here? Why would we start a study of archaeology kind of in the middle of Israelite history? And my position is, and the position of many, many scholars, not that I'm a scholar, but I agree with these scholars, is that the destruction of Israel and the exile of the people marked what should have been the end of the Abrahamic and Davidic promise. God promised to grow a great nation and that they would live in the land forever, and now they were completely obliterated. And in the ancient world, when your country and your king was defeated, your God was defeated as well. And so this should have been the end. And the people of Judah knew it. They knew this is the end. Israel is gone. They've been gone for 100 years. We were promised that God was going to stay with us. And so they started trying to make sense of this. And instead of just giving up and saying, forget about it, we'll become Babylonians and do the Babylonian thing, they stuck to their core briefs, but they went back and they started reinterpreting what went wrong. What did we do that was wrong? Because clearly something happened. And during this time in the exile, both the 100 years between them and the exile, they start writing down their history. Now they had other sources. The Bible talks about the annals of the king of Israel. They had stories of Abraham and Moses and David. All of these sources were there, but this is the time where they pulled it all together and compiled it into a single text. And this series of events that we just spent the past 2 weeks talking about influences everything. You cannot escape the influence of this event. And when we get, not next week, but the week after, when we get back together, we'll go back to Genesis and we'll start talking about some of the other events, but we'll see, I think once you understand the trauma and the big deal of this event and how it shaped it, you see it everywhere. You can't, it changed. When this was first explained to me and I started going back and rereading Genesis, the creation story, the Garden of Eden story, the Moses story, the Abraham story, all of a sudden it was like, oh, it's all tied back to this. Not that those stories maybe didn't exist in some form, but they got retold in a way that the nation would understand, to bring them out of. And somehow they hung on to their core beliefs. They hung on to their culture and their religion and became, and there's a whole nother chapter then of Israelite stuff to talk about. They came back to the land, they rebuilt the temple, and it gave to us both the birth of what is today rabbinic Judaism, because there's no more temples, right, for Jews. They don't go and sacrifice animals anymore, but it gave birth to the rabbinic form of Judaism, where it's all teaching and they're a religion of the book, and they teach and they read and they study and they debate. Gave birth to Christianity. None of it, I would posit to you, would have happened had this chain of events that we just talked about had not happened. I think if this had not happened, eventually Israel would have just kind of died out and it would have been a forgotten religion. But this whole event galvanized the ancient Israelites to really go through and think about what happened and to write down all this stuff that we have today. Questions, comments?
So even though they were exiled into Babylon, when they were there geographically, they were able to maintain themselves and their culture. They had their own little neighborhood area, areas of worship. They weren't just randomly.
We'll talk about that, but no, they didn't. The Babylonians, it doesn't appear that they did that. It doesn't appear that they just scattered them. They let them come in. They had to work. They had to be part of the culture. They broke them up. What they did do, and to the benefit of the Bible, is you had northern kingdom, southern kingdom, everybody kind of tribes. They all kind of were doing their same thing. They intermixed them together so that in order to dilute any political uprising power. So they were like, hey, I don't want all the Judeans hanging around together because they're just going to try to take us over again and start having, fomenting insurrection. So they break them all up and they mix them all together. But they were able to live. It wasn't like they were like we get from the story of Moses in Egypt, where they're all in slavery. I mean, they may have been slaves, but there were a lot of Jews who, when the Persians came in and liberated them, didn't go back to Israel. There was a group that went back, but there were a lot who's like, we're Babylonian now, or whatever, Persian, we'll be Persian now. And that's where you start getting this diaspora with Jewish people living throughout Asia, the Middle East, up into Europe, because of that happened because of the exile. They kind of spread out, and they were just like, you know what? I'm not going back. I'm good with. I'm not going to deal with that stuff anymore. So they may have had their neighborhoods, yeah, but they were able to get together, right, as long as they didn't create problems, and they could pull these things together. I think the intermixing of people from all the different tribes, kind of, who had escaped, kind of helped bring all those different stories together, because what we'll see as in the coming weeks is there's some stories that are there's a northern tradition and a southern tradition, and I think they all kind of got brought together into one because of this mixing up of the tribes. But I think they did have, from what I've read, and I'm not a scholar on this aspect at all, but I think they did have some autonomy to discuss and live their life and worship their religion, as they wanted to do it while in Babylon. Not that they were happy about it, but the Israelites, but that's what they did. Any other questions or thoughts or comments? I hope you guys enjoy this stuff. If you feel like I'm going too deep into the weeds or skimming over stuff, let me know and I can try to adjust as best I can. What we'll do, again, I would highly, highly recommend both of these books. They're very good references on all this stuff we're talking about. I'm not following them like chapter, but I'm drawing on both of them as resources. So you can get them both on Amazon, not very expensive. Or if you go to the used bookstore, I've found both of my copies at the used bookstore. No class next week. I will post the video and send out the slides this afternoon. And I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks for coming.
I think your pace is excellent.
Good. All right. Thank you.